Can you stop sharing now, Aaron?
She's a long time.
Should we put the presentation on? Slide still on then? Yes. Yes. And online is on as well. Okay.
Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming to the book launch for the Routledge Handbook of Smuggling. Book launch that we didn't think would happen in person for a very long time. As a general kind of bit of advice to everybody in the room, don't edit a handbook during a pandemic. But it has happened and we have an in-person book launch and we're really, really happy that we've had to do that and that everybody's come here. And also thank you to everybody joining us online. A quick rundown of what we'll do. Florian and I are going to talk about the book in general a little bit, and then we'll have 3 quick deep dives into 3 of the chapters in the book. And then we'll kind of have a wider open panel with questions and answers and try to talk a bit more broadly about smuggling studies, why it matters and where we are and where we go from here. I'm really happy that a couple of people have been able to join us today that have been a part of the handbook. I'll start with Florian Weigand, my co-editor, who is also the co-lead of the Center for the Study of Armed Groups, currently at ODI, and also an associate researcher at the London School of Economics. And his book, Waiting for Dignity, is about to be out. His book, Bullets and Bandits? Conflict and Transnational Crime. Conflict and Transnational Crime, that has a subtitle that includes the word bullets, is already out with Edward Elgar, and I can highly recommend it, despite the fact that I wasn't able to remember the title. Shalaka Thakur is a PhD student at the Geneva Institute for Graduate Studies, and Priya Deshingkar has joined us all the way from the University of Sussex, where she is a professor in migration and development, and works in particular on South-South migration. And we'll talk a little bit later as well about the kind of non-goods part of the smuggling that, thank God, we've been able to include on the panel today as well. So thanks all for coming. To everybody who's online, we will take questions online later as well. Please put them in the chat. And ideally, if you're putting questions in the chat, please kind of, if you want to reveal yourself, put your name and affiliation in there as well, so we can read that out alongside with the question. The entire event is recorded, just as a context, so we will behave ourselves at least while the cameras are on. And one further online note, the entire handbook is available online for free to download, either chapter by chapter or as the entire handbook. You can Google it and I'll send you to the Routledge page, or more easily, we have bought the domain smuggling.page. So if you go to that page, you can find the entire book online and for free. There's a beautiful copy there as well, but it is a little bit more expensive. Also, thanks you very much to Gary, to IDS Comms Facilities, and everybody who's made it here today so we can do this. So without much further ado, I'll talk a little bit about the book and then pass on to Florian. So, the Routledge Handbook of Smuggling, why does this exist and why do we have it? We've broadly kind of tried to, is this working? No, this is not working. I'll just use this. It's also not working. I'm speaking, no, this, we'll get there. Once the presentation's on, it's going to be worth it. It's going to be great. There's pictures. There we go. This is what on. There we are. Yes. So we've kind of split the beginning of this presentation into why does this book have to exist? Why should anyone be interested in it? And then once you've had some vague interest in it, what is inside it? So why do we need to understand smuggling better? So this bit is potentially a little bit less for everybody who's a part of this book, but everybody who hasn't really worked on smuggling that much or hasn't been obsessed with it for years, maybe it's worth briefly justifying a little bit why this is more than just a marginal area of development studies of politics and of understanding the world today. There's an easy pitch for that, which is if we look at the picture on the top left, that is a boat that is carrying goods into Iran. And it has been one of the kind of most described cases of smuggling as a consequence of international sanctions. Now, if we've been talking about international sanctions in the last couple of weeks and months in the conflict in the context of Ukraine and Russia, there's a very, very obvious reason why we need to care about smuggling to understand the unexpected and unintended consequences that policy decisions have nowadays. But we can look more widely beyond that particular case. If we look at the second picture, it's the current Home Secretary, and obviously exemplifies the fact that smuggling has not just been a part of how migration and mobility has been framed by various governments across the world, but also that a certain understanding and a certain political framing of smuggling has been really, really central to political discourse, especially for conservative governments around the world. And that is often framed, and Priya can speak to this much better than I can, by the particular politics of those governments rather than by the knowledge that we have accumulated about migration, legal and illegal, and south-south and north-south migration over the last couple of years. So there's a discourse that is quite segmented and quite separated from what we actually know about smuggling. So there's a second reason why we need to understand it better. If we're looking for examples of that mismatch between how smuggling is treated in politics and how it's understood by people who study it, border fortifications, border infrastructure, and border walls have become an absolute symbol of something. It's become a symbol of an incredibly popular policy intervention that's seen very, very skeptical by a lot of those who work on it. But it's also become a symbol of the wider obsession of the modern nation state with its borders, with its sovereignty. And it's become part of this wider framing where in kind of a modern globalized world, states and smugglers are being presented as these kind of antagonists in a fight for global order or disorder. So it's become a symbol of that, but studying it in detail starts unpacking it really quickly. And its usefulness starts unraveling and its kind of political importance becomes salient. But this isn't just a modern topic. So if we look at the bottom right, that is the very kind of ideal of the signature, the John Hancock, the first signature under the American Declaration of Independence. If anyone's read Peter Andreas's wonderful Smuggling Nation, John Hancock was, amongst other things, a smuggler. And if we look back at the history of not just American independence and the development of the US ever since, but if you look at, we're in Sussex right now, the history of South England, the history of Europe, the history of border making across the world, smuggling pops up throughout it. Smuggling is a really, really important part of the history of how power and trade and geography have adapted throughout the world. So having a historical aspect that is also really important. We're really, really happy that we have that in the book. And finally, if we look at picture 5, there's a really, really obvious reason to care about that, which is that smuggling not only, but also largely happens in borderlands, and millions of people across the world live in borderlands. Millions of people across the world are affected by the policies that we institute them, often without understanding smuggling as well as we should. Millions of people across the world are affected by border restrictions, by migration restrictions, by walls. So we should care intuitively about all of them, and smuggling and understanding it better is a really important aspect of that. So if I've now hopefully vaguely interested you in the topic, the next question is, why do we need another book on this? There are plenty. And I've just put a couple of the covers on the wall. And the reason I've done that is that Florian and I were quite obsessed with smuggling book covers for a while, especially as we were thinking about the covers for this book. And there's really, really quickly patterns start to emerge. It's hard to get a good picture for smuggling. There's the kind of, if you look on the right-hand side now, you've got your kind of historical figures, often men with hats in like drawings. Often there's a ship somewhere involved or someone's carrying something in the dark. Moonshine is a really central theme, so we've got that in the top 2 covers as well. So you've got these kind of historical covers that already start to hint towards figures of darkness and things happening in the darkness and underground. Then you've kind of got your covers on the bottom of the page that very much focus in on illicit drugs and illicit goods. So there's a whole, you could do a whole gallery of covers that usually have a stack of drugs that have been confiscated and some policemen or men with guns standing next to them. So that's a whole other kind of imagery of how smuggling is portrayed in books. And then on the right, you have the sense that this is all somehow connected. This is all kind of, you know, you've got the dirty entanglements of them all, where you've got the guns and the cocaine and the money and the terrorists and all that kind of connected. And that's another really, really prominent theme in how smuggling is kind of sold to a reading audience across the world. And we didn't quite want to replicate that because we felt that a lot of the themes that you saw here are a part of an imaginary of smuggling that is sold to an audience. It's a part of an imaginary of smuggling that is sold to a political audience, but it doesn't necessarily fully represent smuggling studies and the work that's been done on it. So the picture that we have to cover the handbook is this wonderful picture called Displaced Nexus by Fernando Morales Tovar. And aside from the fact that we think it's absolutely gorgeous, we also think it really, for us, spoke to a couple of things that we've learned about smuggling that are really prominent in the literature on smuggling, but that you don't really find in the covers of all these other books. And the first of all, it's that despite the fact that the vast majority of the handbook speaks about the smuggling of goods, the picture is about people. And we think that that's a really common aspect of a lot of the scholarship in the book, but also of how we should study smuggling, which is that even if it is about goods, it's primarily about the people that carry them or don't carry them or try to interdict that. So putting people front and center and not making it people kind of that are wearing that have their faces covered or that are being othered or that are being presented as just random men with guns, and putting these people in the center without those suspicions is really important to us. And the second bit that we thought was really helpful is that the border, if at all presented here, is not presented as a line in the sand. It is presented as a structure held by people. So I think that also recognizes a really, really central part in work on smuggling, which is that borders are humanly made constructs. They're social constructs, they're political constructs, they're historical constructs, they're made by people. They don't exist external to us, and that in order to study what happens to them, we need to study these institutions and from where they come from. So we're really happy when we found that picture that kind of put these things to the center. The other thing we really liked about it is that when you look through the central kind of plane, the colors start changing. And there's a chapter in the book by Marijke Schomeris and Dr. de Vries on how narratives change as they cross borders, on kind of narratives as a smuggled commodity. That also points out how, you know, if you look across border, the view changes and the story changes and the perspective changes. So that was a really kind of nice detail in that we had as well. And the final thing, that this didn't feel sensationalizing. This isn't, you know, trying to tell you there's something that's coming to get you, but there's something that's intriguing and that's worth studying. And that's very much what we try to do with the book. So what did we try to do? Kind of our very mission statement at the beginning was to bring together and to center contemporary social science scholarship on smuggling in a resource that's accessible to different audiences. And that bringing together, I think, was really the starting point of it, because having worked on this for a while, it's really, really obvious that smuggling studies, to the degree that it exists, is incredibly segmented. It is segmented geographically. It's that there's a very strong literature, for example, on African borderlands, that doesn't really speak that much to literature on Latin American borderlands or a literature on South Asian borderlands. It's segmented by methodology, as much of academia, unfortunately, is, and it's segmented by discipline as well. You've got geographers not speaking that much to economists, not speaking that much to political scientists. So one of the things we really want to do is get these things in conversation with each other. But we also felt that beyond kind of a kumbaya of bringing all that together, there's really strong comparative insight in that. And that's something we hope to do in the book as well. You've got chapters on cocaine and chapters on rice smuggling, and you can read them back to back. And I think from these different perspectives come really interesting and helpful comparative insights. And through bringing all that together, you also get a more holistic view of what smuggling is today. And you don't just get the view from the perspective of cocaine smuggling studies. So that was something that was really important to us. I think there's also this idea of centering it. Smuggling so often exists at the margins of other research. It exists like, you know, like a little footnote somewhere in a World Bank report. It's often seen as an unexpected consequence. So bringing it together in one place and getting it to talk to each other, especially goods smuggling, because I think migration has a bit more of those conversations, was really important to us. The contemporary social science scholarship of it on the one hand is a little bit exclusionary, despite the beautiful cover. There's not a lot of scholarship on art in the book. There's not a ton of scholarship on law in the book. It does come a little bit more from a social science perspective, but in that it is incredibly diverse. And I think in that it also has an audience to speak to each other. And it is also unapologetically academic. There's hopefully policy insights in there, but it's not written as a policy guide. It's also not written as a how-to smuggle guide, to the great disappointment of our publishers, but it is written as a conversation of academic scholarship. And finally, we wanted to make a resource that is accessible to different audiences. That is, different audiences within the academy. So we hope we've put together a book that for seasoned smuggling scholars is still interesting, because they get to read kind of some of the other perspectives and still kind of get a new perspective, but also a book that's useful to junior scholars who start to study this. One of the things that we did in the handbook was have quite an extensive session on methodology and how do we study this, which we hope is going to be useful for people who want to approach this, but also it's useful for people who've worked on this in a long time and help us have this conversation about how we studied this in the past affected what we know by it and know about it, and where do we go from here. And also we hope to make this more accessible to policy practitioners, and we hope to make this more accessible to a global audience. We've brought together scholars from all around the world studying smuggling in all regions of the world. And again, I'm going to keep repeating that throughout this evening. It is available for free online. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Florian to talk a little bit about what is in this book, which is available for free online.
Thank you, Max. You forgot your wine. It's really fantastic to have an in-person event again. It's much less socially awkward to drink a glass of wine at a public event rather than at home in front of my laptop. So what's actually in this book? As Max has already mentioned earlier, like we really try to make smuggling the center of it rather than having it at the margins. But then we kind of confronted with the challenge that smuggling is really studied from so many different disciplinary perspectives, different geographies. It's really kind of all over the place. So what we try to do is really structuring it along certain themes. So we're kind of starting it, if you look into the introduction, with like a general overview along the lines of what Max has already been presenting. And then we thought it would be really interesting, even though it's a bit perhaps unconventional for a handbook, to go into the method. So how does one actually study smuggling? Because also in terms of a disciplinary perspective, it's usually at the margin. So kind of bringing people together who perhaps study smuggling in different ways. So there's a chapter that does qualitative methods, one that does quantitative methods, but then also a chapter, for instance, that looks at where is smuggling actually located? Where do we find smuggling? How do we approach smuggling? And then also a chapter that really deals with the security and the ethics challenges that quite naturally evolve when engaging with a topic like that. The second theme of the book is really about borderlands, and it really draws on this really rich strand of literature on borderlands and the people and the communities in borderlands. And we try to explore how do smuggling and borderlands actually shape each other. And so that theme really engages with like the communities, how do they perceive it? To what extent is smuggling perhaps viewed as legitimate also locally? What role do borderland brokers play? What role does gender, for instance, play? How, to look, there's so many different interesting chapters, and how, for instance, are narratives smuggled across borders? How are stories constructed around smuggling in different places in borderlands? And then the next chapter perhaps is what you would really expect in a handbook on smuggling. So that is looking at smuggling of goods, and we try to have this entire spectrum where we go from like the highly illicit goods, opium, cocaine, but then we kind of look at cigarettes on the way towards really illicit goods like rice in the Philippines, and perhaps goods that we don't really necessarily think of if we read the word smuggling somewhere, but that perhaps are much more essential for many communities than these goods that are often in the media when we think about smuggling or when we hear about smuggling. But we're going to hear more on that from Max, who's going to talk about cigarette smuggling a little later on. Then the next theme is smuggling mobility. And we really had a long discussion in terms of how to engage with people smuggling in this book, because we really didn't want to make it sound as if it's just the same as smuggling goods. So we wanted to have a very dedicated section that really engages with human mobility in a broader sense and kind of looks at, okay, what similarities might there be with smuggling of goods, but also in what ways is it distinctly different? And is it a distinct strand of literature that is separate from the smuggling of goods. And Priya is going to talk about labor migration in the global south. There are other chapters that, for instance, deal with humanitarian smuggling, with how smuggling of people has been criminalized over the last few years, and other related aspects. And then we're going into a slightly more specific theme, and this is the relationship between smuggling and conflict. We'll have a presentation by Shalaka a little later, who's going to tell us more about how smuggling works in Northeast India and what role insurgents and armed groups play in this. But other chapters, for instance, engage with the question of what Max mentioned earlier, which role has smuggling actually played in the history of the US in relation to conflict? Illicit trade and conflict, how have they contributed to what is now the US, but also contemporary war economies? What do they look like? There is often this assumption that smuggling is crucial for war economies, but really, how does it work in detail is another chapter. And then one that engages a bit more with the policy. So often there are initiatives to deal with what's often framed as this conflict crime nexus. What are the implications if we develop policies that target that, and what unintended consequences may that actually have? And then the final theme is really the policy theme of the book. So this is about addressing smuggling. What is commonly done and what are the implications of that? So we have one chapter, for instance, that looks at smuggling at sea and the legal dimension of that. And then we look at the criminalization and the war on smuggling and the implications that has. And then we have a chapter that's perhaps a bit unconventional, but that looks at how local communities actually adjust to smuggling and how communities adapt to what's happening. And also, last but not least, how this entire spectrum of smuggling has been actually affected by COVID and how it has been changing, particularly over the last 2 years. So the next slide, because this book is not just the four of us, it's actually 40 people who have been involved. I'm sure many of them are online at the moment because Brighton is quite far. It's from people around the world. Max did a fantastic job in actually bringing these people together digitally. So just to give you an impression of all the people who have been involved in this project, our sincere thanks to everyone involved. Really, it has been fantastic working with each of you. During the pandemic, working online, it has been really also a fun experience and a learning experience for all of us. I'm not going to read out all the names. If you look into the table of content, you'll see everyone, but this is everyone who has been involved in this project. Before we then getting now into like the details of 3 different chapters, perhaps a couple of overarching themes that we think emerged out of the book. So, of course, this is the academic thing to say, smuggling is context specific. That's perhaps not a surprise. It's of course shaped by the laws. So because smuggling is defined as something that it's in opposition to the law, how laws are defined in a specific context really shapes smuggling, or what is considered to be smuggling. But also, of course, the type of goods may affect how something is smuggled, the value chain, supply and demand, and the markets where this good is actually demanded. But then, and that really comes across in quite a few of the chapters, smuggling is very historical. It has roots, and often actually smuggling is nothing else than trade that has been there for a long time, where then at some point, often by colonial powers, borders were drawn that kind of interrupt this trade, and now we view it as smuggling. Then smuggling, and again, that comes through, particularly in those chapters that have a very empirical perspective, is actually normal in many borderlands. So again, smuggling has this, as Max pointed out earlier, we have this like kind of imagery in our head of somebody with like a backpack in the mountains, but often smuggling ultimately is informal trade that's happening across main routes. It's happening in the broad daylight, and people who are involved in it perhaps would consider themselves to be business people who in a very legitimate business environment. But then smuggling is also, like, even though it is kind of by definition in opposition to the law, it is nonetheless unregulated. And Max has been pointing that out in his other work as well, but there's a lot of regulation that's happening to how smuggling is done in terms of agreements that are formed between smugglers and state authorities, but also between smugglers and, for instance, non-state armed groups, which Shalaka is going to talk about a little more later on. And finally, smuggling is not necessarily limited to borderlands. Of course, there is the act of smuggling, of kind of crossing a border, but then there's so much more to it in terms of where's the good actually coming from, where is it going to? And if we then think about financial capitals like London that actually play a key role in illicit and legal trade, but also in smuggling ultimately. So kind of drawing this all together, we tried to come up with a broad definition of what we actually mean with smuggling. And we did not impose that on the people who participated in the book. So when you read the book, you'll see that many people use smuggling in slightly different ways and define it in different ways. But kind of looking at the entire book, we thought that smuggling can really be viewed as an economic activity that is very politically defined through, for instance, legal structures, but it's also socially embedded in communities. We have a longer version of this that's a bit more detailed in the book, but perhaps this as a final slide in terms of what we actually mean when we think about smuggling in this book. So as Max has already pointed out, this book is available for free at smuggling.page. But before elaborating on that, which we will, we're going to get into 3 of the chapters in a bit more detail. I'm not sure, we're starting with Shalaka, who's going to talk about the relationship between insurgents and illicit trade, and the presentation is called Checkpoint Chefs, and I'm going to hand over to her.
Max, can I shut that window? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. So in this chapter, I've explored what role insurgents actually do play in the smuggling economy at a very important crossing at the Indo-Myanmar border. And I'm going to start with some context and then get into the different ways in which they're involved. So here, the big black dot that you're seeing on the map on the left, this is roughly where the border crossing is. It's in the state of Manipur in India, which borders Myanmar. And on the right, you're seeing a Google Maps image of how it looks from the top. The white line that you can see is the international border. And the town in which I did most of my research is called More, that you can see over there. Now, when you are entering from Myanmar, there's this very impressive looking integrated checkpost, and all the goods that are coming in through Myanmar are supposed to be crossing through it. But it's barely used at all. It's empty most of the time. At the same time, based on estimates from local businessmen and from the Indian military, there's trade to the tune of close to €1 billion just at this crossing. And all of that is informal and illicit trade. So it goes from everyday items, you have fruits, vegetables, clothes, electronics, but you also have drugs, mostly heroin and methamphetamines. Wildlife, Burmese teak crosses a lot. And along with this trade, you also have a lot of non-state armed groups. Before that, here's a picture of how it would go. So vehicles would stop on the Burmese side, and then people would come in with head loads, and they just load it onto trucks on the Indian side. And it's a porous border, so there are lots of crossings where you can do this. No one would really stop you. No one would care if you're taking pictures or anything of that sort. With all of this trade happening, you also have over 6 secessionist armed groups. And because you have these secessionist armed groups, you also, of course, have a very, very heavy Indian security presence. So the state of Manipur that More is in has a population of 3 million. And you have over 50,000 Indian security forces for that population. A disproportionate amount of them are situated at the border. So to understand the role that insurgents are playing in the smuggling economy, I did 2 things. The first was, of course, speaking to smugglers themselves on how they encountered non-state armed groups. But I was also interested in seeing how these groups perceive their own involvement. And I think this quote really encapsulates that. So here, a member of the Kuki National Organization, that's an ethnic group that's active in the area, he's saying that what we wanted was for them to pay, which we are entitled to. And they are on our land, and without a question, they have to provide tax to carry out trade. So you have the word tax, and it has to do with their land. There is even though they do need this also for funding and financing, there's always a political justification to how they do get involved in the trade. What's interesting though is that for the smugglers and for the traders, they are not really drawing a distinction between the state actors and the non-state armed groups that they're dealing with. So the biggest way in which both state and non-state actors are involved is by taking a cut of the goods or by taking a fee. And in the case of the armed groups, they'd call this tax. In the case of the many state actors that are present, it's basically just bribes, but they also call it tax. And for the smugglers, it doesn't matter. It's just another actor who they have to pay. All right, so this is just a picture of the terrain, so you get an idea of what it's like when you're going into Moreh and across to Myanmar. A truck that is crossing over from Myanmar and then entering Moreh would be stopped at least 9 times on a 100-kilometer stretch to the capital of Manipur. And all of these stops would be for informal collections. You have a couple of formal security checks as well, of course, but up to 20% of their shipments worth would usually be collected on just one ride. One of the reasons why traders engage in smuggling rather than formal trade is, of course, to avoid state tariffs. But at the same time, armed groups do play a very big role in shaping the smuggling economy the way you see it here. And that's because if you paid state tariffs and you were also paying 6 non-state armed groups, that becomes far too expensive. And so instead, it becomes a lot more feasible for you to just bribe everyone on the way instead. Another way that they're involved is by creating informal barriers to entry. A teak smuggler who I was interviewing called them business partners. Most of the interview, he was just complaining about how they threaten him and how parasitic they are, how they're just taking. But at the same time, he calls them business partners because they become a very formidable force for any of his potential competitors to deal with. Even though he finds them parasitic, the fact that most people cannot deal with this situation gives him a bigger market share. And finally, albeit indirectly, a third way in which they are shaping the smuggling economy is by bringing in state security forces. Because there are all these secessionist groups at the border, there's a huge presence of state security forces, all of whom also are taking informal taxes and bribes. In fact, this is considered to be such a lucrative posting that the state police pay between 500 to 5,000 pounds, depending on whether you're just like a lower rank constable or whether you're an officer, to be posted here because it's considered that lucrative. Their willingness to take bribes is in this situation pretty pragmatic, but of course it further cements the smuggling ecosystem that you can see here. There's also a lot of variation between armed groups that are in active confrontation with the Indian state versus those who are in a ceasefire or a suspension of operations. And you see both these kinds of groups at the border, which makes it quite interesting in terms of comparison. When it comes to the groups that are fighting the Indian state, the border provides them a safe haven on the Burmese side. At the same time, this also prevents them from being able to be involved in a very regularized manner. They take big yearly payments from some businesses, from most businesses. They are actively involved with some businesses, but every single truck that's flying down this road, they can't collect from them. On the other hand, groups that are in a form of a ceasefire, they have been able to almost put up their own checkposts, and they take very regularized cuts from every single vehicle that's passing along this way. So smugglers say that all groups have always taken from them, but since the ceasefire and suspension of operations, some armed groups have felt emboldened to basically just set up a gate. And as I myself have seen on multiple occasions, sometimes their collection points are just a stone's throw away from the state authorities. Since I've written this chapter, a lot has changed. So you had COVID, you had the coup in Myanmar, and it's changed a lot of the smuggling dynamics. What it's also allowed is it's allowed for security forces who do want to stop insurgency funding and who want to curb smuggling, who are a very small section of the security forces present there. But it's allowed them to close the border. And with these border closures, they're able to engage in a lot of commodity choking. And this has had an effect on insurgency funding. Even if you look at the budgets or finances of the non-state armed groups, the commodity choking has affected them adversely. But if you speak to the business community, they don't think that this is a way to deal with the insurgency. In fact, they think that commodity choking is going to lead to a resurgence of violence, that people who were otherwise benefiting from a thriving smuggling economy, when that's taken away from them, they're instead going to take to the gun in a more active way again. So in an ironic way, while the presence of the conflict and non-state armed groups has shaped the smuggling economy has sort of kept the violence in check by giving a lot of actors who are involved in the violence a piece of the pie. So to conclude, the idea of this chapter was to understand how insurgents are involved in the smuggling economy. And what I found is that it's very convoluted and varied. Far from the non-state armed groups work with smugglers in a nexus and the state is competing with them, you just have a lot of counterintuitive associations instead. First, in many ways, the non-state armed groups are shaping cross-border ecosystems just like states do, by creating barriers to entry, by regulating who can do trade, by regulating what this trade is going to look like. Secondly, in the presence of armed groups has led to a great deal of Indian state corruption. And this is now the de facto way of doing trade. And finally, that the ceasefires and the suspension of operations are leading to a regularization and systemization of the smuggling economy, I think that has some interesting implications. On one hand, it can almost tell us about how smuggling can maybe be seen as a way of buying peace. But at the same time, it would be too simplistic to say that there's then an inverse relationship between conflict and smuggling. Because in order for this kind of ecosystem to exist, the conflict needs to survive, the non-state armed groups need to be there, and the state actors who are benefiting from their presence need to justify their being there too. And yeah, that's all from me. Thank you. I think Max is next, right?
Yeah, sorry, it is me again. Jasmine Bhatia was meant to be with us this evening, but wasn't able to make it due to a family health emergency. But her book, her chapter on brokerage with Kevin Kohler and Jonathan Goodham is in the book, and I can highly recommend it. But in the absence of that, you'll have me talking about cigarette smuggling really briefly. So the chapter on cigarette smuggling is one of a set of chapters in the book on the smuggling of different goods. We've got a chapter on cocaine, we've got a chapter on opium, we've got a chapter on arms, on wildlife, on petroleum, on cigarettes, and on rice. And as I mentioned earlier, in these different kind of goods-focused chapters, we did want to set up the groundwork for some comparative work between these different smuggling goods. And so the kind of question I asked myself when I put this together was to think about what type of good are cigarettes when they're being smuggled? What form of smuggling do we get from this type of good? What is this a category of? And if you think about the different goods that are being smuggled a lot that we typically associate with smuggling, cigarettes aren't an immediately obviously smuggled good. There is a legal and well-established markets for cigarettes in almost all countries across the world. So contrary to cocaine or opium or tusks, it is relatively surprising that there would be a large market for smuggled cigarettes. Similarly, cigarettes are a bulky good in terms of the value per gram. Cocaine or opium is a much better thing to smuggle than cigarettes. You need large infrastructure to smuggle large amounts of cigarettes. They're also non-essential. So compared to rice or petroleum, cigarettes aren't used that much. They're somewhat of a luxury good. So for all these reasons, it is relatively surprising that there is a large amount of cigarette smuggling across the world. And yet there is. About 650 billion cigarettes are smuggled every year. About 11% of the global total market of cigarettes is smuggled. Of all the legal goods, so the non-cocaine opium, it's hard to think of a single good that is smuggled as much. And that is in itself already quite a surprising thing and quite a good reason to study it. One of the common answers for this is that it is because cigarettes are taxed very heterogeneously. That, that creates price differences between different countries. But if we look very broadly at kind of the global coverage of cigarette smuggling, it's interesting that it's not the high tax locations where a lot of smuggling happens. If it was taxation that drove cigarette smuggling, we'd imagine a lot of cigarette smuggling around the borders of the European Union, for example, and we don't see that much of it. So there's clearly more than that going on. So what the chapter on cigarettes tries to do a little bit is build on the fact that this is one of the best researched smuggled goods in the world, partly because there's a large public health literature that's really, really interested with the global tobacco epidemic and its consequences. And as a consequence of that, we have a really, really interesting body of literature on cigarette smuggling and on cigarette consumption and illicit production. That literature doesn't always speak to other types of smuggling literature. So what I try to do in that chapter is try to see, okay, if that literature were to speak to smuggling more widely, what would it say? What can we learn from cigarette smuggling for smuggling more broadly? And there's two quick points that I'll make in kind of the next 2 minutes or so. And the first one is that we need to look beyond prices. So it's lovely that Joe is here this evening because we've got a project together in Sierra Leone where we showed that, for example, cigarette taxation went up really strongly in Sierra Leone because Sierra Leone was one of the few African countries that had recently increased cigarette taxes, which is a really, really great way to finance the public health impact of the tobacco epidemic and also decrease smoking uptake. And it is a stunning policy fact that kind of policy tool isn't used as much in developing countries as it could be. So Sierra Leone really strongly increased cigarette taxation. And the classic talking point, especially of the tobacco lobby on this is, if you increase taxation, smuggling will go up, so don't put up taxes. Interestingly enough, in Sierra Leone, that did not happen. Taxation went up quite a bit and smuggling didn't go up quite as much. And we have an increasing body of literature that shows us that smuggling cigarettes isn't just about prices. And that just if you put up prices, again, there should be a lot more smuggling around the European Union, and there isn't as much. So it's not just about prices. And I think especially if we look at goods that are not generally illegalized like cocaine or opium, there's a common assumption, especially in the economics of smuggling, that assumes that this is all about prices. This is all an arbitrage economy. And I think looking at cigarettes really teaches that that's not the only thing that's going on. That on the one hand, state capacity in interdicting this is one of the factors that are going on. So to what degree can states control their borders? The fact that tax stamps, track and trace systems, those kind of systems can engage with that is one of the things we can learn from that literature. But also, interestingly enough, I'm sorry, I just keep pointing at you, Joe, Sierra Leone doesn't have either of those things. It doesn't have a strong track and trace system, and it doesn't have strong control of parts of its land borders. So that leads us to look a bit more deeper in what is actually going on. Who is actually doing the smuggling? Who are actually these actors? Is it, as Florian demonstrated earlier, the people carrying stuff across the mountains that we currently think about? Or is it much more formally embedded actors? And if it is, that means the relationship between the state and them goes much deeper than just where can the state build a wall or where can the state see who goes across the border. And it much more becomes a question of what is the relationship between the state and the business community. And that points to the second thing that I think studying cigarette smuggling can teach us about studying smuggling more widely, which is to look at the legal industry. There's a large illegal cigarette industry in the world, and there's a large legal cigarette industry in the world, and these are not entirely unconnected. And cigarettes are an interesting case study to study that. They're an interesting case study to study where do illegal cigarettes move into legal markets? What is the relationship between that? But also to what degree has the legal industry historically had an interest in either directly smuggling cigarettes or tolerating the smuggling of cigarettes. There's been historical cases where formal tobacco companies have vastly oversupplied certain territories that definitely need that many cigarettes, knowing that they would go into the surrounding markets at a cheaper price. And that is something we can observe when we look at cigarette smuggling. That's certainly also something we can observe when we look at smuggling of a whole other set of goods around the world. So that's a kind of a very kind of clear transferable insight there from looking at cigarettes, but also if you look at the smuggling of cell phones, microwaves, petroleum around the world, this kind of strategic relationship between a legal industry and an illegal industry is really, really critical. And this is a good case study of it. And finally, one of the things that's been really fascinating by engaging with the group of people who've studied cigarette smuggling is that because of that industry role, this group of scholars has also gotten very, very careful about the role of the industry in knowledge generation. So as I mentioned earlier, the tobacco industry has been really, really prominent in pushing the argument that we really shouldn't increase cigarette taxation because that will drive up smuggling. So they've been themselves a really active participant in putting out certain talking points, in funding research, in funding certain types of data collection about smuggling. So the people who study cigarette smuggling have been a really interesting community that's been very cautious in policing the boundaries of funding for their research and seeing what industry involvements are central in building the knowledge that we have now on smuggling. If there's a massive new conference in Ethiopia on the risks of cigarette smuggling that puts out talking points like repeated on newspapers, what data is this built on and who's funded that data collection? It's something that in this particular part of smuggling studies is really strong. I think that the rest of smuggling studies can learn from the study of cigarette smuggling. There's a fascinating project on tobacco taxation and tobacco tactics at the University of Bath that has done a lot of research on this, and just to kind of put some of the names on there that they have on their website about organizations that have taken tobacco money to then produce research or research adjacent outputs that have repeated tobacco industry talking points. And it's quite an illustrious list, and there's a lot of people on there. And I think that's not something that only exists in research around cigarette smuggling. It certainly also exists in research around other goods. But I think this is one bit of smuggling studies where it's been studied really well and where the community of scholars has been really aware of that. I think the rest of the community of smuggling scholars can learn a lot from that. So I will end this here and pass on to Priya.
I don't have a presentation. Right. So thank you all for coming today. It's a real pleasure to talk to you about my contribution to this excellent and exciting book, which is available to download free, by the way. I work on migration in its various forms. And one of the things that has become increasingly significant is human smuggling across borders. So that's what my chapter is about. And it's focusing primarily on South-South human smuggling. So what you hear a lot about is smuggling from the global South into rich countries. But what that kind of obscures is how much is actually going on in the global South itself. And that's also true of migration, generally speaking, both South-South migration and internal movements within countries. So the international discourse seems to give you the impression that all movements are from the South to rich countries, and there's a tidal wave of people coming to take us over, basically, but that's not the case. And there's a lot happening within the global South, and there is human smuggling because there are barriers to movement even within the global South. So my focus is on how people become irregular through crossing an international border irregularly or illegally, as they say, although we prefer not to use the term illegal. Because it has certain connotations. I mean, no person is illegal, and their movement has to be understood as a product of the politics of mobility and migration. So it's becoming more and more difficult for people to move across international borders, and there are more and more barriers being erected to that movement. I mean, there are various ways in which people become irregular. So they can overstay visas, they can de-link from tied work permits. I mean, you see this very much in the Middle East under the kafala system. They can be rejected asylum seekers, and that's very salient at the moment, you know, because we've just recently passed the UK Nationality and Borders Act here in this country, which can criminalize asylum seekers and make them irregular and therefore, you know, equivalent to criminals in the eyes of the law now, which is a hugely negative development for all of us migrationists, because it, you know, strips people of the right to asylum. And by force, many people have to cross borders irregularly. So they are loading onto all of these boats and dinghies that we're seeing in the English Channel for a variety of reasons. I mean, there's, you know, all kinds of triggers for people undertaking these extremely risky journeys, like conflict. They can be environmental degradation or shocks. And all, you know, this is creating this kind of surge in mobility globally. And at the same time, receiving countries are cracking down on that kind of mobility, which is extremely cruel, of course. And there's an increase in mobility also because of work. Now, that's again where my chapter focuses on. It's smuggling that is being done to facilitate the crossing of people who are looking for low-paid work in other destinations. So they're coming from relatively poor regions in the global south and trying to access remunerated employment. And there are millions of people globally for whom that is the only way of accessing that kind of employment, because, you know, it's virtually impossible for them to get a visa through official channels. And yet there's a demand for them as well. So this is what the politics of mobility and migration control and border control seems to overlook completely, even in this country, that there's a huge demand for migrant labor. And these are the people who fill all the low-level jobs. You know, they are the people who are working in the agricultural fields. They're the people who are working, you know, as garbage collectors or loaders and unloaders and all the sort of menial jobs and the low-level jobs that keep economies running. And the same dynamics actually played out within countries. So it's in cities, you know, it's migrant labor who actually keep the wheels turning. And yet, the system is completely loaded against them. So internationally, when that happens, they have to resort to smuggling. So it is that kind of process, you know, that is the kind of missing link here. So I focused on 3 countries in particular, Bangladesh, Ghana, and Myanmar. And that research was undertaken under a long 10-year DFID-funded research program. DFID was the erstwhile Department for International Development of the UK government, which has now been renamed. But that funding enabled us to do really cutting-edge research on South-South migration. So this work synthesizes that research done by our research partners in these countries. And the focus, as I said, is migration for low-paid work. So in particular, construction work and migration for domestic work, which between them absorb like hundreds of millions of people. You wouldn't imagine the extent of that kind of work. And it's a global phenomenon. So it's the lowest, how should I say, it's the easiest work to access for people on an undocumented status. So it's very easy to get work as a construction laborer for men, and it's very easy to get work as a domestic worker or care worker for women. So those 2 sectors are highly gendered, and they're very important. And they're also very significant in this discussion on human smuggling. So I've looked at how people are smuggled, or men and women are smuggled, through quite distinct networks of brokerage and smuggling from these 3 countries. And you see that the whole process is not confined to the border alone. So it's very much embedded in wider society. It starts in the places where they live. There's usually a local broker involved who's the first point of contact between that migrant and the world of smuggling. And that broker will often sell them a package, so you pay a lump sum of money, which is quite a significant sum of money if you look at it compared to their earnings. They might finance that through the sale of assets or borrowing, or they may even undertake debt migration. So they may become trapped in debt, which has been portrayed extremely negatively in the discourse on migration. But if you talk to migrants themselves, they see it as opening up opportunities for them. So those are the ways in which they undertake these journeys. And it starts with usually a village level or, someone nearby, village level broker, who then links up with others in the chain, which may or may not be quite clearly structured. Now, with increasing surveillance of everything that's happening with smuggling, these chains are not very, defined or set, and they can be quite opportunistic. So these brokers and sub-agents and ultimately the head smugglers or the lead smugglers may link up with different people depending on where the route is being monitored. So we see that there's quite a lot of changing. And of course, that increases the risks because they're working with unknown people. It also increases the costs. And that's once again where I would like to kind of link my chapter with what's happening with the UK Nationality and Borders Act, because what that's going to do essentially is to increase the costs and risks of migrating for people. It's not going to stop anything because none of these controls have ever succeeded globally in preventing or stopping irregular movements. Because there is a demand there as well for people, you see, and that's the hidden part of it all. So what it will do is increase human suffering, increase the costs, create a nightmare all round. It's going to be expensive for the UK government. It's going to be expensive and horrendous for the people who undertake these journeys. And I just don't know how it's going to play out. I mean, we were horrified that it actually got passed. So there we are. So that's what the chapter is about. And for women, I just want to say that there's an additional layer of controls as well in many societies, because, a lot of these women who migrate for domestic work come from rural patriarchal societies where there's a lot of control on their movement beyond the family. So work outside the home or the village is heavily controlled socially. And there are social barriers against doing that, but there may also be government barriers. And a number of countries, including all these 3 countries that I've looked at in detail here, have at one point or another banned the migration of women internationally. They've either put bans on the migration itself or bans for particular kind of work, because the underlying, philosophy, if you like, is that women need to be protected. They're more vulnerable. They don't know what they're doing. They're vulnerable to sexual exploitation. And of course, if that happens, then, there's shame on the family, there's shame on the community. But again, those bans haven't worked in any of the places where they've been implemented. And eventually, the governments have had to withdraw them. So this happened in Ethiopia. This happened in Ghana, I think, certainly in Bangladesh and in Myanmar as well. So those are the things that are quite interesting about all of these controls, which despite the huge record of failure, continue to be popular in the imagination of policymakers. And that's what we're seeing now, even with the kind of border controls that are being implemented by the UK. Thank you very much.
Thank you. In terms of what we'll do next, we'll take some questions, and I think it might be good, given that everybody who's in the room has braved the rain of Sussex today. If we start with a couple of questions from the room, and then we'll move on to questions on island. Okay, so if anyone online wants to ask a question, if they can put it in the chat, we will collect them in the chat in the Q&A box. And in the meantime, if anyone in the room has any questions to anyone in the panel, otherwise we'll start asking each other. So if you just, if you start with Joe, just walk up to the microphone and then just let people online hear you as well. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. My question is that there are certain goods which are restricted by the state, but then there are certain goods which are actually restricted by the society. And there's a social taboo attached to consumption of these goods. How is the ecosystem different when it comes to smuggling of goods which have social taboo versus the other goods which don't actually have a social taboo? To give you an example, I mean, back in India, I mean, cattle trading is now sort of looked down upon. So the society sort of imposes its own restrictions. Yet, I mean, the society then also tries to solve for it by smuggling. So do you see the ecosystems being different? Thank you.
Who's going to answer that one?
So it's always, ideally, if it'll make it easier for us if the question is clearly directed. I mean, I can start off, and if anyone else wants to pick it up. I mean, it's more an observation than a question, but I think it's a really important observation. I think there's a tendency in looking at smuggling to look at the kind of the legal relationship between the goods and their trade, right? And if something is smuggled that should not be moving across that border at all, or should certain tax be paid on, that's what smuggling is, and that's what we focus on. But I think looking at the social dimension, the social norms along that, is really important from two perspectives, right? So on the one hand, we have a lot of goods that formally, technically, the state calls smuggling, but within borderland communities is often highly normalized. And if you look at a lot of the research on smuggling, exploits that fact because it means you can talk to people about it in borderlands. If smuggling is normalized in borderlands, it makes it much easier to research. It's often more socially accepted. There's less of a kind of a sense of shame associated with it. And depending on where you're going, opium production or trade of it might be entirely socially normalized. So looking at that dimension alongside kind of the legal regulation is really critical. And I think, as you say, looking at those social norms in terms of what's socially not legitimate is equally important. And it can be something as in your example, where it's technically legal, but it's socially illegal. Or we can look at, I mean, Judith Scheel has a really good book on smuggling in southern Algeria that looks at the fact that, I mean, different things are all technically illegal, but from a community perspective, there's a different kind of social stigma associated with it, or a different kind of image associated with people who study that, people who smuggle that. And that might influence your position on the marriage market. It might influence your social status. It might influence how the rest of your community sees that. So looking at both these things next to each other, I think is really critical. So I don't have an answer to that, how it plays out everywhere, but I think it's a really important dimension. Does anyone else want to?
Yeah. So I can give you an example of how it plays out in the context that I'm looking at. When I started doing fieldwork, people would distinguish between traders and smugglers, even though everything was smuggling. So apart from like the few goods, like some vegetables and fruits that were completely clean, everything was smuggling. But they used the word smuggler only for people dealing in drugs or arms. And it took me a while to even figure that out, but I think that's interesting for two reasons. One, that this distinction is drawn by not just the state forces, but also by a lot of the non-state armed groups, some of whom don't engage in drug smuggling either. But also that the word smuggling, it still does have these moral connotations. Legally, everything was smuggling, but morally, only that was smuggling.
I can also add. Is that working? Hello? Yeah. Yeah, so I think you raised a very interesting question there. Now, in my experience, I think whether or not people regard something as licit or illicit depends a bit on how much they personally stand to benefit from it. So they're prepared to turn a blind eye or condone it or even accept it if they stand to gain from it in some way. So it may be morally unacceptable, but there's a lot of hypocrisy involved around that. So, they may show that they don't approve of it, but they may be secretly, supporting it because they can make a profit from it. And I think that probably applies to, the kind of split you're talking about. So it depends on how included they are in that business. Because if they're included and especially if they're impoverished otherwise, they're more likely to support that then.
There's a really great chapter by Christoph Tieteke on this in the book on kind of perceptions in borderlands and how people frame smuggling. I'm just going to start advertising chapters now.
Thanks everyone for the very interesting presentation. I have two questions. One is more for those who worked on the smuggling of goods, and is how much the physical infrastructure of the state at a border post might influence the prevalence of smuggling of particular goods. I'm thinking back at some direct experiences of situation in Sierra Leone where the lack of capacity of interconnectivity to use the IT system led to smuggling because they could not just cope with a system that if it was manual, they would have been able to deal with on the state side. So I'm curious if that is more of a thing. On the smuggling of people, I'm very curious to know if there is a perception in the global south to south smuggling of people, that part of it is driven by the labor market of the recipient country. So I'm Italian, and I always had a very strong suspicion that if one looks at politics, the reason why we have the perverse immigration law that we have is that our agricultural system won't be viable without a very big share of irregular labor. Now, if one looks at which parties have pushed this law in parliament, they tend to be those mostly supported by landed classes. So one can draw the comparison with what's happening in the UK too, if one wants. Is that a thing in the global south too, or the politics in the recipient state plays a different role there?
South as well. So yes, so there is, as you said, there's a clear demand for migrant labor in many sectors, and I think that's a pretty universal phenomenon in most receiving countries, whether they're northern or southern. So that's one of the reasons that migrants want to go there in the first place. I mean, take the case of Libya. From our point of view, it may be a failed state and an absolute mess, but it's a very important labor market for migrants from West Africa. So it's not that they're just going to Europe, they're heading to Libya first, because they know that they can get work there easily and very well paid work. And in fact, they say, migrants from Senegal and Ghana say, it doesn't matter if we can't cross over to Italy this time. We're happy to stay there for another year because we're earning so much more than we would be earning at home. So they just hang around till they can make the crossing to make it even bigger, but there is a demand for them almost everywhere they're going. That's the point. Otherwise it wouldn't sustain the system.
Would you say that the demand is for the unregulated? So my suspicion is that if there was regulated labor, in particular global north countries, then the demand would be lower.
You're right. It is true. Because if they're undocumented, they're easier to control. They can be exploited more easily. And that's exactly what the employers want. That's what we call hyper precarious labor, because they're trapped between immigration regulations and also being, exploited at work. So that's exactly what's happening. Yeah.
And maybe a couple of thoughts on your first question with regard to infrastructure, which is actually something we really interested in and actually want to study a little further. But I think, Priya, you mentioned it in your presentation already, like infrastructure, of course, doesn't actually, building a wall or investing into policing doesn't actually stop smuggling, whether it's people or goods. However, it really affects the economy and it benefits certain types of businesses and disadvantages other types of businesses. And I guess the assumption would be that those who kind of either have more financial resources or have better connections with those controlling the infrastructure are better positioned to kind of continue smuggling businesses. So it will perhaps empower those actors that are already in a stronger position in advance. That's speculation, but yeah, I would argue it changes the economy, but by no means it kind of stops smuggling, regardless of whether it's goods or people.
I have nothing to add to what Florian said, and we've written something on this together. I think both those questions are really interesting examples to the degree of which people who study mobility and human smuggling and the smuggling of goods, even though it is fundamentally different, can speak to each other in a really meaningful way. I really like what Priya, you said in your presentation earlier about how physical infrastructure affects risks and trade-offs and costs. And I think that's very much the answer if we look at smuggling of goods as well. So if we look at border infrastructure, it affects trade-offs and risks and costs. And that doesn't mean smuggling stops, but it means every network needs to ask themselves, what risks and costs can we carry? And that often gives you a sense of what the border economy looks like a couple of years after you've built a wall, or depending on how you've changed border infrastructure and what you've installed there. So I think doing more work on infrastructure and its perverse dynamics and where they come from and what politics drives them, I do think is the next big thing on this. But also your question on demand. And I mean, the well-established point that, the demand for cheap labor has an impact on global migration. The same is true for goods, right? So when we think about how UK press, European press plays the reporting around drug smuggling, it is Latin American networks are flooding Europe with cocaine and causing violence and havoc on our streets, right? That is a large part of the media narrative, where again, the focus is on the supply, the focus on the people that, and again, the image of the smuggler as, the dark actor that brings the stuff here. The demand, which is very much homegrown and which is very much a part of that entire story, is often not a part of that narrative because it's not politically convenient, but it is very much a part of why is this happening and how do we address it? Martin, you had him? Shall we? Do we have online now?
Yeah, we did.
Okay, let's do online first, and then we'll come back to the room.
Okay, so this is from Maya Rabbani from LSE, doing an MSc in comparative politics. I'm keen to hear how, or if, for example, the smuggling legitimacy connection could potentially be hindered by endogeneity in the analysis, and how one would locate proxy variables for an issue area like this, specifically in the global south, where so many salient factors or variables overlap.
Very economics question.
Yes.
So I feel like the way the question is, I feel like I'm going to translate from econ to the rest of the panel. I think the way the question is phrased hints at an econometric approach to studying this, which I think is fascinating as a starting point, but is incredibly difficult. And I think that is one of the reasons we don't have all of that yet, is because it is incredibly challenging to disentangle, as Maya pointed out in her question, the various different factors that are at play in borderlands, and especially, Florian has written a book on this, so you can talk about this better than I can, Flo. That obviously how people perceive legitimacy in these contexts is once again incredibly loaded and incredibly complex. One of the results of that, we try to do this in the book a little bit, try to figure out how have we studied this in the past, what methods have we used, and how has that affected what we know. I think one of the things that we've ended up with is an enormous amount of an incredibly rich literature that is based on ethnographic methods, and that is based on deep embedding in borderland communities, because that's the best way in many contexts to untangle these different dynamics, to figure out if people speak about legitimacy and smuggling in a borderland context, what do they really mean by it? So I think often there's little alternatives that people have found to spending an enormous amount of time in these communities. And so a lot of that work is deeply qualitative. However, I think to the frustration of some of the people who've written in this book as well, what's happened there is that often, again, this is siloed. Often, again, these don't speak to each other. Often, again, we have a lot of incredibly deep ethnographies that haven't necessarily always contributed to theory building. So I do think, again, personally, I can't think of a good proxy variable that's going to give you an easy quantitative strategy of studying legitimacy with respect to borderline actors. But there's increasing amount of work on surveys and surveying borderline communities, and we have a chapter in the handbook on this. But also, I think the attempt there of trying to aggregate across a wider circumstances is really important. I think my hunch would be comparative work is going to be stronger there than kind of large N econometric work. But good luck to anyone who's trying, and I'd be curious to read it. Sure.
I'll just add a couple of words. Thank you, Maya, for the question. I agree. I think it's an incredibly difficult one to study with quantitative methods. Not impossible, but really tricky. I personally, doing qualitative work, found it already really difficult to kind of explore legitimacy with qualitative research methods, just because it's such a multi-layered concept. But I do think looking at smuggling and legitimacy of smuggling. So first of all, like Christoph Titiker's chapter, which has been advertised before, is really worth looking at. But I think there are a couple of, let's say, qualitative proxies we could look at when it comes to legitimacy of smuggling in borderlands. And I think one is language. So what is the language that's actually used locally to describe these activities? And the other one is this level of normalization. To what extent is it actually publicly accepted? To what extent do people actually care? And I think actually doing qualitative research will give you a very fast idea of how easy it is, as Max pointed out earlier, to actually do research on this, which I think will provide insights into the local perception of legitimacy of that specific activity. But yeah, great question, but unfortunately no great answer in terms of the more quantitative approach to this from my side. Thank you.
I can give a colorful example again. So as Florian mentioned, language, with what I mentioned previously, when you use the word traders versus when you use the word smugglers, but also in the context that I've been studying, what the communities do when there's a crackdown on what is smuggling is a good way to see the legitimacy of that particular kind of smuggling, which does happen during this commodity choking that has been occurring. There have been a lot of protests, not just by the business community, but by locals taking to the streets and stuff like that.
Do we have more online? Okay, in that case, we'll go back to it.
I'll take two if that's all right.
We'll see about that.
So the first is that we've talked a lot about the content of the handbook, but I'm really interested in the process by which it came about, and this could be directed at the editors, but also the contributors. I feel it'd be interesting just to hear reflections on the kind of process of coming up with the idea of it, pitching it, herding cats to actually get the thing produced and so on. I'm sure there's a lot you could say. Whatever is interesting would be interesting to hear. But I had one question particular about it, which is, the way we are often pushed in terms of professional incentives as academic researchers is away from organizing our work on the thematic basis to do with whatever the empirical phenomenon we're studying is, and towards disciplinary or methodological or theoretical boxes. So what's the enterprise of trying to produce something which is in fact organized around this? And you said it's a kind of center smuggling, and I can see that's really great, and it's been super interesting for me, who doesn't follow this at all, to listen to. But in terms of kind of the kind of professional incentives you have, and then what you want to do next with this kind of project, what's the function of it for you all? And then the second question is probably a really annoying one, but I'm really curious to ask it. So I think that you've made very clear that you are interested, when you talk about smuggling, in looking beyond just what people think of when they think of physical goods, also smuggling people. But there's still things like physical things. So then what about the intangible economy? So smuggling illicit flows of finance across borders, or data, for example. I'd be really interested to know how all of this maps onto that. Thanks.
Yeah, I think I have a couple of answers that connect both of those questions. On the process, I think the original idea came from the publisher. So I think Routledge came to us rather than us pushing it the other way around. And you've gently hinted at the fact that professional incentives for junior academics, at least in the UK, strongly advise against editing handbooks because they're not refable and they might not be seen as entirely helpful for furthering an academic career. I think from an early point on, there are a couple of considerations. I think partly it was certainly a labor of love rather than a kind of a strategic career move. But also I think very much recognizing that we thought this should exist and it really didn't. And it was really surprising to us that that kind of space didn't exist. So I think that was a starting point. The process was arduous because it was a pandemic, and as an editor, your ability to put pressure on your authors really decreases when they can, claim that they're various relatives of COVID. But I think given that context, it worked really, really well. I think aside from the fact that Florian is just an incredibly kind and patient man who kind of cooled all this down every time I was about to call an author. I think the thing that worked really well is that a lot of people were on board with this really early on. So we're really surprised that we had a kind of top hit list of all the big names we wanted. And James Scott's the only one who said no. Everybody else, Peter Andreas, who by the way is the patron saint of this book, was a lot of the kind of really, really great people, a lot of the people who really wanted on this said no really, really early on. He said yes really early on. And that made an incredibly pleasurable product because it really feels like a book that we thought needed to be there. And now it is there in the way that we thought it should exist. So I think we've, hopefully overcome some of the professional frustrations there. In terms of the Intangible Economy, that is one of the really big regrets I have with the book, is that we really wanted a chapter on finance. And we had a great author for it. And COVID decreases your ability to really call out your authors, especially if they're head of large organizations, and we both know them. So I think that made that one really difficult. It's the one chapter that I really think is missing, and it would be great to have more on. But aside from that, we'll take that loss given how many other wins there are in there. But I'll let you add anything else.
We were very hesitant at the beginning. I think we reached out to a couple of other people who had edited handbooks before, and the advice was not very encouraging. But we really thought, as Max has said, there is an absolute gap. Why is there no book that brings smuggling together? There's so much interesting research out there, hidden in different disciplines, on different goods, but it's not really speaking to each other. We're all doing our own thing. And so we thought it would be just really interesting, but also really fun to kind of bring the work together, but also these people. And we also really viewed it as an experience to kind of get to know all these people who kind of will define or do define whatever we want to call it, is the field of smuggling studies. And that's been very much part of the experience. So we kind of had an opportunity to engage with everyone's super exciting work, but we also really got to know people. And that's why we're sitting here together. And it's fascinating that Laura's really great after 2 years of working remotely to kind of meet the people who've kind of contributed to this. And I'm sure this will kind of continue in various forms of collaboration. So even though we were hesitant at the beginning, I think we can say we really didn't regret it. It's been an absolute pleasure. So anyone who is thinking about doing a handbook, please feel free to reach out. We are perhaps on a more positive side than most others on this. Yeah. Thanks.
I think I'm also rethinking the career aspect of it. I think I'm not sure I would discourage junior scholars from doing handbooks again, partly because, it's not refable, but you really get to know your field. And you really get a sense of who's interesting in your field, who's reliable, who has their RAs write their chapters, who hates each other. It's in terms of getting a sense of what's your field like and who's doing interesting stuff. For that, it's been really, really helpful. And I've learned a ton, including from everybody who's sitting here. So that's been really great as well.
Yeah, just add something to that. I think what you didn't mention is the magical word impact, because bringing this kind of volume together does magnify your and everybody else's impact in the research world, and may not be refable, but it does matter. I think, in terms of getting your work known and getting it out there. But I just wanted to say something about the materialities aspect, or the infrastructure and the flows of money, etc. That's been very well researched, actually, in the world of migration. So there's a huge human geography and anthropology literature around unofficial flows of money the so-called Hawala system and how that works for the movement of people. There may be some written about the movement of goods as well, but I know that there's a vast literature on that, and it's mainly based on ethnographic work because you can't do it otherwise, but it's been very well researched. And there is also theoretical and empirical work on the materialities or the infrastructures of migration, as it's called, where we look at not just the social networks, but also the actual material aspects of it, so things like transport vehicles and networks and roads or airports and airlines, so that's also part of that work. So that has been looked at, and it is in a sense a pity that we don't have that in the volume. So maybe for the next one. Okay.
Thanks. Yeah, I found that really interesting. I have one question and one small reflection. Sorry. The reflection is that I think it's interesting with smuggling that, looking at it, and it's been mentioned from the perspective of legality rather than from political economy. So I think about the situation in Lebanon and Syria, where prior to the Syrian civil war, the Lebanese ruling class benefited from a transient flow of workers because they had an open migration policy. But when there was a conflict, they then generated smuggling, generated precarity, generated an insecure population, because they wanted to maintain that precarious workforce. Before they had it because the workforce had no reason to settle there because the economies were very different. You could carry out your social reproduction life in Syria where the costs were kept low, and smuggling was something that was created by the state, but also the state has to play this game where it pretends it's also against it. And that's like a really interesting dynamic that some of the conversations. The next question I have, the actual question, is, and I don't want to do the sort of nonsense academic thing of saying everything is smuggling. However, I've been working recently on an interagency evaluation of the humanitarian response in Yemen, and one of our evaluation questions that we were asked to look at was whether or not the humanitarian response has prolonged the conflict. So there's aid capture, and there's direct aid capture, and there's non-direct aid capture. So in Yemen, when WFP bring in food or goods or anything through the south, it then has to move to the north, and it's taxed again by the Houthis, who are technically a non-state actor. The UN calls them the de facto authorities. They are actually obviously in charge of most of the state, but they're not legitimately recognized. So should I have said, there's still time, should we say that smuggling, is that smuggling in the context of a civil war where you have an authority that really is in control, but is not legally recognized as such, is applying another taxation? Would you say that even moving these massive amounts of humanitarian goods through the Houthis where they apply a secondary tax, is that a smuggling network or not? Yeah.
Good question.
I'll pretend the answer so that the rest can think of it. So I'll stall to give them some time. First of all, on your first reflection, I think that's a really important point. Flo and I have written quite a bit on smuggling in states. And I think the idea that these are adversaries is incredibly simplistic, right? So smuggling and the state historically have emerged at the same moment, because pre-state there is no smuggling. It is directly created by laws. And states' relationship with smuggling are myriad, right? So we have smuggling by states. We've got a project on the former East German regime that was very aggressively involved in getting stuff that you wouldn't be able to legally get into the country illegally, so that its elites could benefit from it. States tolerate smuggling, states tax smuggling, states channel smuggling. So that this relationship is not just an adversarial structure, but that it's embedded in the political settlements and political economy of elite maintenance and kind of rent distribution within a country is a really, really critical part of it. And Lebanon sounds like a fascinating case study that I don't know nearly enough about. So fully agreed on that point. I'm going to pass on to everybody else on is there smuggling, but I think my instinctive reaction would be, does it matter? Right? So I think the question is, the term has a certain international connotation, and the second people talk about smuggling, everybody gets a bit uptight. It's a little bit similar to, I think, actors in, don't quote me on this, it's a little bit 3 glasses of wine. It's a little bit similar to actors in conflict
This is recorded.
and terrorism, right? The second you call something a terrorist organization, something happens with the international system. Rules start clicking in, and certain institutions start acting. It's a little bit similar with smuggling as well. That I think there's the reality of, in a particular context. I think Shalaka's work is particularly fascinating on that, because state and non-state actors interact with these different kinds of goods. I think just the fact that it's smuggling doesn't itself mean that much. The question is who is doing it and why. And I think as a consequence of that, that is also the way you plug in thinking about smuggling into thinking about the nature of the state more broadly, right? Because it teaches you at a micro level how regulation, be it formal regulation or informal regulation, creates economic incentives, creates barriers to entry that create benefits and power to others, and how that interacts with each other. So I think that is where, for me, a lot of that really micro kind of ethnographic border work speaks really meaningfully to the way the modern economy functions and the way to which kind of break stuff and apologize later capitalism can function in a really small way, but then also in a really large one. So I think the definition there itself isn't the meaningful one. It is, why is something smuggling? Who makes it illegal? Who regulates it? And what does it say about the power structures that are around it? Hopefully I've bought some time for you guys.
I'll add a couple of thoughts along very similar lines. I don't think there's an empirical answer to this. Is it smuggling or not? But I think the answer is much more, is it analytically or on a policy level helpful for you to call it smuggling? So on the analytical level, are there any kind of comparisons you could draw, other kind of literature, other kind of trends, dynamics that could kind of help to kind of develop what you're researching there? So it could be helpful to call it smuggling. But then I think the other dimension is really the policy dimension. It does come with a certain baggage to terminology. And the question is, do you want to go down that pathway or not? And so I think it's about what's the intention of the research and what's the lens you want to apply and what's most helpful. And I think you could justify either calling it smuggling or not in this specific case.
Just add my 2 pennies worth here. It reminded me of something that I observed happening in Sri Lanka after the tsunami, because the eastern part of the country was controlled by the Tamil Tigers, and they were channeling remittances from abroad where they have very strong connections to mobilize help for tsunami affected communities. But of course, they were deemed to be a terrorist organization and illegal by the state. And therefore, everything they did was illicit or illegal. So there's a kind of parallel there. You could analyze it as some illicit activity or illegal activity. But on the other hand, they were actually more effective in delivering help to people because of their efficient network and being able to bypass some of the sort of bureaucratic hurdles that the official system had. So it's a similar kind of conundrum, I think.
I think in that case, we are at 6:30, unless there is really burning questions in the room. I think I would use that opportunity to say thank you to everybody on the panel. Thank you to everybody who's joined us online. Thank you to everybody who's come here today. Thank you to IDS, ICTD, Gary, and everybody who's helped make this happen. A couple of final points to anyone who's joined late or joined late online. We have a recording of this that's going to be on YouTube. In case I have not mentioned this so far, the book is available online for free to download if anyone would like to. And also my understanding is that there is wine left over that should in some way be recycled or used. So if everybody who's still here could assist us in that, we will be very grateful. I think with that, thanks to everybody. And yeah, the book's online.